Hello again and welcome to Virtual Crafts. In this video we'll see how we can change the file or directory's permissions in Linux, how we can add the permissions and how we can remove the permissions. As you know that Linux is a multi-user operating system, so it has security to prevent people from accessing each other's confidential files. So that's why Linux has this extra layer of security that individual files and directories can have different permissions. If I list the contents of a directory using the ls command, I only guess the list of the files and directories, but I do not get any additional details. To get the additional details, we use the command ls-l, or you can simply use ll instead. And this gives us a detailed version of every file. The first column here represents the file's permissions. The second column represents the user that created the file. The next column represents the group owner of the file. The next column represents the size of the file in bytes, and the next column specifies the date and time the file was created, and then finally the last column as the name of the file. And same follows for directories as well. So talking about the permissions of the files, these are the 10 characters that set permissions for a file or a directory. Now let's dive deeper into these 10 characters. The first character can either be a hyphen, a dash, or the alphabet D. If the first character is the hyphen, it means that this particular listing is a file, and if it is the character D, it means that this is a directory. Switching back to my directory contents, you can see that this is a file, and the first character is a dash. And the ones in blue are directories, and we can see that the first character is D. So now we are left with the rest of the 9 characters. Now these 9 characters can be broken down into 3 different sets, and each of these sets represent a different permission. For example, the first set is meant for the permissions of the user, the second set represents the permissions of the group, and the third set represents the permission for any other user. Now each of these sets has 3 characters, and what do they mean? They mean read, write, and execute permission. If we set all 3 for the user, it means that the user will have read, write, and execute permissions. Moving forward, here are some examples of how different permission combinations can be made. For example, if the first 3 bits are set, read, write, and execute, it means that the user has read, write, and execute permissions. For the group, if we only have R bits set, the group will only have the read permissions. And in the last set, if we have this combination, the other users will have read and execute permissions, but they won't be able to write to the files. So there can be multiple other combinations, for example, read, write, and no execute, or write only, or execute only, or many others. So this is a short overview of what these 10 characters mean. Let's get back to Linux and see how we can set these permissions. So to demonstrate how we can set permissions of files and directories, I will quickly create a dummy file. And if I list the files, this is the file I just created. And you can see that the first character is a dash, which means it's a file. The user has read and write permissions. The group has only read permissions, and others have only read permissions. And now we'll see how we can change these permissions, how we can add new permissions, and how we can remove permissions. Now to change the permissions, we use the command chmod, which means change mode. Then we write the set for which we want to change the permissions for. For example, if we are changing the permissions for user, we will write U. If we are changing the permissions for the group, we will write G. And if we are changing the permissions for others, we will write O. For example, if I am changing the permissions for the user, I will write U. And then as I am adding the permissions, I will type plus. And here we will write the character corresponding to the particular permission. For example, for read permissions, I will write R. For write, I will write W, and for execute, I will write X. But as we can see that for the dummy file, read and write permission for user is already set. So we only have to set the execute permission. So I'll just say that I'm giving execute permission to the user. And then finally, the next argument will be the name of the file that we are changing the name for. So this is it. Press enter, and the permission for the user have been changed. To verify, I will list the contents again, and you can see that the execute permission has been given to the file. Now let's say I want to change the permissions for other users. I will type chmod o plus, and this time let's say I want to give it all the permissions, read, write, and execute. Press enter. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the file argument. I will have to write the name of the file and press enter, and then if I list the contents, you can see that all three are set for others. And it is also possible that you can change the permissions of more than one group at a time. For example, you can change the permissions for user, group, and others at the same time, then press enter and read, write, and execute. Now this will give read, write, and execute permissions to user, group, and others. I will write the name of the file and press enter. I will list the contents again, and you can see that all of the permissions have been set. So this is how you can add the permissions to files, and similarly the permissions can be changed for the directory. Alright, now let's see how we can remove permissions. It is similar. As we have set the permissions, you will have to type the same command. Let's say I'm removing the permissions for other users only. I will type O, and instead of plus this time I will write negative or minus, and here I will type the permissions I want to remove. For example, for others I want to remove the write and execute permissions for the dummy file, and press enter. And if I list the contents, you can see that the write and execute permissions have been removed. And as I mentioned earlier, you can remove the permissions for more than one set, like this: user, group, and others minus write and execute. Now this will remove the write and execute permissions for user, group, and others. Oops, I missed the name again. And here you can see that now all three sets have only read permission. So this is how you can remove the permissions from a file. Alright, now there is another way to add or remove the permissions. Instead of using R, W, and X for the corresponding read, write, and execute permissions, we have their octal equivalents. So these are the octal equivalents of all the permissions. And in fact, we don't write these numbers to set the permissions. We write the decimal equivalent of this encoding. For example, if I want to set the write and execute permission for a file, I will write 3. If I want to give all the permissions to the file, I will write 7. So going back to Linux, let us say that I want to give all the permissions for user, group, and others for the dummy file. I will have to write chmod. The first decimal number I write will be for the user. Let's say I want to give all the permissions to the user. I'll write 7. Let's say I want to give only write and execute permissions to the group. I will write 3. And let's say I want no permissions to be given to others. I will write 0. And then again, name of the file. If I press enter and list the contents again, you can see that for the user, all 3 permissions have been set. For the group, the write and execute permissions have been set. And for others, no permissions has been set. So you can use the octal encoding as well, as this is really handy. You can see that you only have to type the number instead of writing UGO plus read, write, and execute. So this is pretty much all. And this is how we change the file permissions in Linux. If you have any questions, you can ping me up in the comments or through my email. If you like the video, please consider subscribing and hit the bell icon next to it. Thank you, and see you in the next video.